Welcome to Heart of a Shepherd as we come to Jeremiah chapter 51. Our study today is titled, Look On with Horror, for Babylon is Fallen. Jeremiah chapter 51. I do want to invite you to follow with me in the scriptures as we consider this chapter. Only one chapter to go before we conclude our study of the prophecies of Jeremiah. Well, the Lord chose Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon to chasten Judah and punish the nations that oppressed Israel and Judah down through the centuries. Now, arguably, Babylon was the first great world empire, and the other countries of the Middle East and Egypt bowed to the will of the king of the Chaldeans. And yet, like all great and powerful nations before and since, the sins and debauchery of Babylon's leaders and people proved its downfall. Consider with me then Jeremiah chapter 51. Now, in the first three verses, we have the Lord's controversy with Babylon. Now, Jeremiah's prophecies against Babylon continued in Jeremiah chapter 51. Now, leave it no doubt that the Lord is sovereign of the nations. We read in verse 1, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will raise up against Babylon and against them that dwell in the midst of them that rise up against me a destroying wind. Now I wonder if Jeremiah was stunned by the Lord's revelation when he declared, and I quote, Babylon is taken, Bel is confounded, Merodach is broken in pieces, and her idols are confounded. Her images are broken in pieces. Now that's quoting Jeremiah 50 and verse 2. Now the Lord foretold Babylon's adversary would, quote, come out of the north and leave a path of destruction, and the Chaldean nation would become a land desolate, and none shall dwell therein. They shall depart, both man and beast. Chapter 51 and verse 3. And then consider how the Lord remembered his people, verses 4 and 5. Now, amid the Lord's pronouncement against Babylon came the promise that he had not forgotten his covenant with Israel. Now, Jeremiah assured those in captivity. Now, remember, Jerusalem is destroyed. The people are led away captive. And so this letter comes to the captives in Babylon, and it is an assurance from the prophet that when Babylon's demise came, and I'm going to quote now, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together, going and weeping, they shall go and seek the Lord their God. Verse 4. Now we know captivity lasted 70 years, and the majority of those led away to Babylon perished. Nevertheless, God's people could look past the hardships and cleave to the promise that the day would come when they would, quote, ask the way to Zion, that is to the mount upon which Jerusalem and the temple was built, ask the way to Zion with their faces thitherward, saying, quote, Come, let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that shall not be forgotten. Verse 5. Well, the Lord then, verse 6 through 10, exhorted his people. Now, the people of Israel and Judah became, we read, like lost sheep, led astray by their shepherds, kings and priests and prophets, and they sinned against the Lord. And yet, though living in captivity, they were to be ready, for when the end of Babylon came, they were to remove out of the midst of Babylon. Now, again, the Lord foretold the enemy of Babylon would be an assembly of great nations from the north country. Now, from the scriptures and history, we know the great nations that would come from the north was the alliance of the Medes and the Persians. Now, the children of Israel and Judah were to be ready and looking for the day they would be set at liberty to return to their land. You find that in verse 10. And then consider the Lord's warning against Babylon, beginning in verse 11. Now, the Lord did not forget the wickedness of the Chaldeans, which they committed against his people. And so he remembered their joy in destroying, that is Babylon's joy, in destroying his heritage, referring specifically to Judah. And therefore Babylon would be humbled. Her land would become, we read in verse 12, a wilderness, a dry land, and a desert. In fact, verse 13, the ruins of Babylon would become an object of scorn for those who would pass by. Now, who could bring that great empire to its knees and leave its capital in ruins? Well, Jeremiah revealed that the Lord would stir the Medes and Persians in verse 11 to attack and destroy Babylon. Now, those 70 years did pass. The destruction and end of Babylon were prophesied as imminent and its fate sealed. You see, it was the Lord, the Creator, who was against Babylon. We read that he that made the earth by his power, established the world by his wisdom, and hath stretched out the heaven by his understanding, that God, the Creator, determined to destroy the enemy of his people. Israel's God, in verse 16, is the sustainer of nature. And so, as we consider verse 17 and 18, we realize again and are reminded that our Lord knows the heart and the nature of humanity. You see, in verse 19, he chose Jacob, and Israel is the rod of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name. And then, consider that the Lord chose the Medes as his weapons of war. You find them mentioned in chapter 51 and verse 11, and then verse 20. And so the Lord chose the Medes to be his weapons of war and determined that Babylon's army and the citizens of its kingdom would be shattered and broken into pieces. In fact, verse 24 through 26, none of the inhabitants of Babylon would be spared. Well, a closing thought for this historic study, and it is the defeat of Babylon, beginning at verse 27 through 58. Now, when God, you see, sets himself against a nation and its leaders, no man can save it. Though the Lord employed Nebuchadnezzar's aspirations for wealth and power to punish the nations, Babylon would not go unpunished. Describing the scale of the Medes and Persians' army, Jeremiah declared in verse 42, the sea is come up upon Babylon. She is covered with the multitude of the waves thereof. You see, Babylon has spoiled other nations. Now she would become spoil to her enemies. The end of Babylon marked the revival of the children of Israel, who would return to their homeland soon after. Now, all that Jeremiah wrote in his prophecy did come to pass. And to this day, Babylon has not been rebuilt. The ruins of that city lie under the sands of the desert, a testimony of God's judgment. Well, don't forget, my friend, that the scriptures are the word of the Lord, and his promises shall never fail. Well, thank you for being a part of the Heart of a Shepherd, and I certainly appreciate you following in this study. Tomorrow, we will conclude our study of the prophecies of Jeremiah. God bless you, and bye-bye.